Hello everybody, and this is going to take us to our last chapter. Now we're going to look at monetary policy. So we looked at fiscal policy, which is what the government can do, and now we're going to look at monetary policy, which in our country is what the Federal Reserve can do. So we're going to look at interest rates, the balance sheet of Federal Reserve banks, what are some of the tools of monetary policy, Fed targets and the Taylor rule, how does monetary policy work, and what's our big picture. So remember, at the beginning of when we looked at interest rates and investment demand, interest is the price you pay for the use of money. When you borrow money, it's not free, there's an interest component, and there are many different kinds of interest rates. When we talk about the Federal Reserve changing rates, which you may have seen recently in the news, we're talking about the Federal Reserve changing the rate they charge other banks. But there are many different interest rates. There isn't just one. But interest rates are always determined by the supply of money and the demand for money. So in terms of the demand for money, why would you hold money? Well, a lot of reasons. You have to have money available to buy goods and services, and that's referred to as transactions demand. And the more expensive the goods and services, the larger amount of money will be needed, or the larger the value of them. Second reason for holding money is what is known as asset demand, and people like to hold some of their assets as money because money is liquid. If all of your wealth is tied up in assets that aren't liquid, it's going to be very hard to buy goods and services that you need. So if you need funds in a hurry due to an emergency, or you need to run to a store to buy something or anything like that, you need to have some liquid money as a consequence. The downside of holding money is money by itself is not particularly productive. So if you put money in a safe or in your mattress, 10 years later it's still worth exactly the same thing, only in reality it's probably worth less due to inflation. So just having money lying around is not a very productive thing unless you use it for other purposes. Remember, economically, money is a means to an end, it's not an end in itself. And finally, total money demand is going to be inversely related to interest rates. So as interest rates go up, the demand for money goes down and vice versa. Once again, same as with investment, as interest rates are going up, the demand for money is going to drop. Money is going to be more expensive to borrow, and it's going to reduce the demand. If we look at the following charts here, total demand for money is equal to the transactions demand for money plus the asset demand for money. Transactions demand is vertical because it depends on GDP and not interest. And asset demand is related to interest. So as interest goes up, the demand goes down and vice versa. So we'll actually find an equilibrium point for money. It's where these two graphs cross. So your equilibrium interest rate, which is what we saw in the previous slide, that changes with shifts in your money supply and money demand, and interest rates are generally inversely related to bond prices. If you guys ever take a finance class, you're going to run into this more, but bonds generally pay a fixed annual interest payment. If the bond's cheaper, it raises the interest rate. If the bond's more expensive, it lowers it. They're inversely related. With that said, this is now going to bring us to the Federal Reserve. And remember, the way that the government can influence the economy is via fiscal policy, which we already covered, and now through the Federal Reserve via monetary policy, which we covered a bit, but we're going to look at a whole lot more in this chapter. So the Federal Reserve has assets and liabilities just like any other bank. And their assets are securities and the loans they make to banks. Remember, the Federal Reserve only lends to other banks. They don't lend to the public. You or I cannot borrow from the Federal Reserve. And their liabilities are the reserves of commercial banks. Remember, commercial banks like Chase or Citibank, they have to deposit their reserves in the Fed. Treasury deposits from the government, and any Federal Reserve notes outstanding. And Federal Reserve notes are the money we use, the dollar bills in our pocket. Those are considered a liability of the Fed. And here is the balance sheet in 2019 of the Federal Reserve banks. Their assets and liabilities were around $4 $4 trillion. Every country has their own version of a central bank. In the United States, it's the Fed, and this is just a selection of other central banks in countries around the world. But in our country, what does the Federal Reserve do? Well, they do what is known as monetary policy. And monetary policy takes 4 different forms. These are all of the levers the Federal Reserve can pull to influence the economy. Up first is what's known as open market operations. Up second is they can change that reserve ratio, which we've already covered, or how much in reserve banks need to keep. Step 3, they can change the discount rate or the interest rate which banks can borrow money from the Federal Reserve. And finally, they can offer interest on banks' reserves and change that rate of interest. And we'll go into all of the ways these can influence the economy. This is the biggest takeaway from this chapter. Once again, monetary policy. So open market operations are the buying and selling of government securities or bonds. The Fed uses this to increase or decrease the money supply. If the Federal Reserve buys government bonds, and remember government bonds are how the government funds the national debt, if the Federal Reserve buys them, they're going to increase the money supply. They're flowing all that cash out into the economy by buying the bonds. If they sell them, they're going to take the money they get from selling them and pull that money out of the economy. So these are known as open market operations, and they can both buy and sell to commercial banks and the general public. And the Fed does this to influence the money supply. If they sell securities, commercial bank reserves are reduced. They're pulling money out of the economy. If they buy securities, they're injecting money into the economy. So this is the main way the Fed can change the money supply, and they do this all the time. So if the Fed buys bonds from commercial banks, they're going to be gaining an asset in the form of securities. And what are they going to be doing? The reserves of commercial banks are going to go up as well because the money they pay to the banks will become reserves. And it's going to increase the money supply. Commercial banks are going to lose securities but gain reserves. So now the commercial banks have more reserves, they have more money to lend, the overall amount of money in the economy is going to go up. So this is an example of open market operations. So if the Fed buys a $1,000 bond from a bank, it's going to create $1,000 in excess reserves. And if there is, let's say, a money multiplier present here, and in this case we're using a money multiplier of 4, you're going to get a total of $5,000 in lending. Remember your original money and then whatever is subject to the multiplier, so that $1,000 of reserves would become $5,000 in lending. And that's what we're looking at here. $4,000 worth of new loans, the $1,000 initial deposit, and that is going to be what's going on here. The reserve ratio here is 20%. They have to keep $200 of it in reserves. The $800 can turn into loans, and we get $4,000 worth of new loans and a $1,000 checkable deposit. In the previous one, I believe we weren't actually taking into account reserve ratios. This one we are. So remember, it is subject to your money multiplier. You get that excess lending from your original deposit. So by doing open market operations, the Fed has the power to greatly influence the economy. They can greatly expand or curtail the amount of loans present by buying and selling government securities. If they sell bonds to commercial banks, the reverse happens. Commercial bank reserves go down and their securities go up, and now there's going to be less loans. The Fed can sell to the public as well, and you get the same effect as selling bonds to commercial banks. It either increases or decreases the money supply. Whether the Fed sells bonds to the public or commercial banks, the result's the same. When the Fed sells securities on the open market, commercial bank reserves are reduced. If all excess reserves are already lent out, This decline in commercial bank reserves produces a decline in the money supply. The Fed can also do what are known as repo transactions, and these are collateralized loans. They can manipulate the money supply as well. It's another form of open market operations. When they make repo transactions, the money supply is increased, reverse repos decrease them. So it's a loan of money in exchange for government bonds used as collateral. Now, up next in the toolbox of the Fed is the reserve ratio. Now, the Fed has not varied the reserve ratio in a very long time. I believe not since the very early 1990s. But if they do change the reserve ratio, it changes the money multiplier. Remember, the formula for the money multiplier uses the reserve ratio. So if the Fed makes banks hold more money in reserve, it's going to decrease the amount of money that can be used for loans. If they if they decrease the amount of reserves, it will increase the amount of money that can be used for loans. So as a consequence, by varying the reserve ratio, the Fed can have great power over the overall economy. And this can change the money multiplier. Now, the discount rate, remember, that is the Fed is a lender of last resort, short-term loans to other banks. And this is the rate the Fed actually changed. When you hear the Fed raises or lowers rates, they're changing the rates that banks can borrow at, not that you or I can. However, if they do that, it's going to influence all of the interest rates, because if banks have to pay more money to borrow money, then they're going to pass that on to their consumers. So the Fed's not directly changing interest rates on us, but it does have an immediate effect. And a term auction facility is a new thing. It was introduced during the financial crisis, and it's another way the Fed can alter bank reserves. Twice a month, the Fed auctions off the rights for banks to borrow reserves for 28 or 84-day periods, and it allows the Fed to guarantee the amount of reserves it wishes to lend will be borrowed, and therefore will be available as excess reserves to increase lending. So banks can borrow reserves as well. So if we change the reserve ratio, it can have a great influence on the money multiplier. So at a 10% reserve ratio, if we look at our same $20,000 of deposits, the money creating potential of the banking system is going to greatly be reduced as the reserve ratio goes up. So if we vary the reserve ratio, it's going to actually greatly decrease the amount of money the banking system can create, or what we looked at in the previous chapter. Once again, the Fed has not really changed the reserve ratio in quite a long time, but they do hold that power. The discount rate, and this is what you've probably seen recently on the news every time the Fed has a meeting lately and they've been raising rates, that is, the Fed is the lender, remember, of last resort to other banks, and they grant short-term loans so banks can meet their reserve requirements and they have enough capital to keep operating. If they raise the discount rate, it's going to discourage banks from borrowing, and if they lower it, it will encourage banks to borrow. So when the Fed changes rates, they're changing the rates that banks can borrow at, not that you or I can borrow at directly. In 2008, the law was changed and the Fed now can pay interest on bank reserves. In the previous period of time before that, they could not. And because of this, it can encourage or discourage banks to keep reserves. If the Fed's paying good interest on reserves, banks are going to want to keep more money in reserves because they're guaranteed to make interest on them in a risk-free way. If they lower the interest on reserves, the banks will probably want to lend them more. So they can encourage or discourage banks to keep reserves, and as a consequence, influence the amount of lending banks can do. In 2018, they were paying around 1.9% on reserves. That has since gone up as inflation and rates are now higher. And in 2018, the banks held about $1.8 trillion in excess reserves at the Fed. So now, since banks can make money on their reserves, a lot of banks will keep reserves that will make them interest instead of using them for other purposes. And as the Fed can vary that rate, it can influence the amount of reserves which banks will keep. So the tools of monetary policy, and this is important here, open market operations are the most important. The Fed does this every single day. The reserve ratio was last changed in 1992, so it's been a very long time. It's been over 30 years since the Fed has changed the reserve ratio. although they do continue to hold the power to do so. The discount rate was usually a passive tool, but the Fed will vary interest rates more during times of inflation, as we've been seeing now. And interest on reserves is a new tool which has also given the Fed more power to encourage or discourage banks to keep reserves, and they've used this tool quite a bit. So the one thing to know about the Fed is this. The Fed has a dual mandate. It was given to the Fed in 1977 by Congress, and the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve is two things: to achieve full employment and stable prices. So remember, full employment is whatever we deem the appropriate level of unemployment in the economy. It's around 4% right now for the US economy, and they want to maintain a target rate of inflation around 2% per year so prices will be stable. So why has the Fed been so proactively raising rates recently? It's because they are mandated to do so via this dual mandate. The Fed must try to keep the economy meeting these two factors: stable prices and that notion of full employment. And once again, this was a mandate given to the Fed by Congress. Unlike elected officials, the Fed is more likely to engage in this sort of thing because they are not subject to elections. Remember, they serve long terms. Not all of them can ever be appointed by a single president. And as a consequence, the Fed is pretty immune to political pressure. So in this case, that is the dual mandate of the Fed. As of around 2018, when these slides were written, the Fed was targeting 4.3% unemployment. That's been revised down a little bit, but around 4% is where they're striving to be, and about a 2% inflation rate. We're currently greatly exceeding that 2% inflation rate, and that's why the Fed has been raising interest rates quite proactively. So the Fed is literally mandated by Congress to actually do these things. That is once again known as the dual mandate of the Fed. And if we look here, this is what's known as a bullseye chart. In March 2019, that's where our inflation and unemployment was. Right now, we're quite a bit above the bullseye. Our inflation rate is very high, still higher than normal, over 6%, I believe, at most recent numbers, whereas the inflation not inflation, the unemployment rate is a little under 4%, so similar to where it was in 2019. So that's the bullseye chart here. The closer the Fed can get to hitting the center of the bullseye, the closer it can be to achieving the dual mandate. And the Fed will periodically update where they target inflation and unemployment, but that is the mandate that they've been given by Congress, and you may certainly see a question or two on the dual mandate. The Taylor Rule, this is a policy proposed by economist John Taylor, and it suggests how the Fed will adjust the nominal interest rate as it pursues the dual mandate. And based on the idea that if it's forced to make a choice between inflation being too high or unemployment being too high, they'll generally err on the side of inflation too high, which is what they're currently doing. The Taylor Rule assumes the Fed cares twice as much about hitting full employment than it does about its inflation target, and that is something that we've been seeing recently. Inflation is above normal, but unemployment is much closer to where they want it to be. Remember all of the downsides of high unemployment. And in the liner notes here, it goes into various recommended percentages that to influence these things. Not something I would ask on a test, but an interesting point nonetheless. So the definitions of the Taylor Rule are the following. To express it mathematically, we must define first off the inflation gap. That's the current rate of inflation minus the Fed's 2% target. We have quite a large inflation gap right now. And the unemployment gap, the actual unemployment rate minus the Fed's 4.3% target there, and the real risk-free interest rate, we're targeting around 2%. Corresponding with that inflation rate. And the Taylor Rule does have an equation, so the Fed target interest rate is equal to the real risk-free interest rate plus the current actual inflation rate plus 0.05 times the inflation gap minus 1.0 times the unemployment gap. And this was what Professor Taylor himself came up with here. Now, the federal funds rate, and these are the rates that the Fed can influence. This is the rate charged by banks on overnight loans, and it's targeted by the Federal Reserve, and they conduct open market operations to achieve the target. So instead of leaving excess reserves at Federal Reserve banks, which pay less interest than commercial banks, when banks have excess reserves, they generally loan them to other banks temporarily needing the money. The rate charged by the commercial banks on these overnight loans is known as the federal funds rate, and it serves as the equilibrium rate for the market of bank reserves. The Federal Reserve targets this rate by manipulating the supply of reserves that are offered in the market. So the Fed can change the discount rate directly. That's the rate that banks can borrow from them, and they can influence this federal funds rate by manipulating the amount of reserves that are in the market via their open market operations. So they do this by buying and selling government bonds. The Federal Reserve Open Market Committee meets regularly to choose a desired federal funds rate, and then will do the open market operations necessary to achieve it. So once again, the Fed only really has power over the rates that banks themselves pay, so they can directly set the rate that banks can borrow from them, and they can influence the rates that the banks will charge to each other by manipulating the supply of reserves. So monetary policy, we're going to go into the effect it has on GDP and prices. So we're going to influence the market for money, investment and interest rates, demand, and that's going to influence GDP and prices. And we can also have both expansionary and restrictive monetary policy, just like we could have both expansionary and restrictive fiscal policy. If we look here, an expansionary monetary policy that shifts the money supply curve rightward in graph A lowers the interest rate from 10 to 8%, which causes investment spending to go up from 15 to 20 billion. And causes demand to increase. So in chart B here, our investment spending is going up from 15 to 20 as interest rates come down. And as a consequence, now we have more money in the economy. So the lower the interest rates, the more money you will have, the more demand for it, and the more investment. And if we look here, the expansionary monetary policy shown on the previous slide causes aggregate demand to increase and shifts the demand curve rightward from D1 to D2, so that real output rises to the full unemployment level of QF along the horizontal dashed line. So as our aggregate demand is going up, we're now going to have more output. So a restrictive monetary policy, which we see on the right in chart D, causes the money supply curve to shift leftward, increasing the interest rate and decreasing investment and demand. In D, the economy at point A has an inflationary output gap because it's producing above potential output. And we covered that you can have brief periods of inflationary or recessionary gaps. So restrictive monetary policy is going to raise interest rates and reduce the amount of investment and money in the economy. Expansionary is going to lower rates and increase those things. Right now, we've been pursuing a restrictive monetary policy as of spring of 2023. The reason being inflation is still above normal, and that's why the Fed has been raising rates. So in expansionary monetary policy, we generally do this when the economy is facing a recession. The Fed lowers the target for the federal funds rate. They buy securities to increase the amount of money, expanding the money supply, and that's going to drop interest rates and heat the economy back up. So as a consequence, rates will go down, money will be more abundant, and it's going to cause the economy to heat up. So that's expansionary monetary policy. One thing we did see, however, and once again, economics works better on paper a lot of times than in practice. During the recession of 07 to 09, spending did increase, but borrowing was down, and people were afraid due to that recession to borrow. So it can be ironic when people save instead of borrow. It can actually hurt the economy. Restrictive monetary policy, or what the Fed is currently doing. So during times of rising inflation, the Fed switches to restrictive policy to try to get prices back down. They're going to increase interest rates to reduce borrowing and spending, which will hopefully slow the expansion of demand, driving up prices. The Fed is currently doing this right now. We've been dealing with above normal inflation, so as a consequence, the Fed has been increasing interest rates, decreasing the money supply to try to cool off the economy and bring prices back down. So expansionary monetary policy, why would the Fed do this? And remember, the government is much more engaged these days in monetary policy than fiscal policy for all of the reasons we touched upon. Monetary policy is not subject to political pressure as much or anything like that. So in something like unemployment and a recession, the Fed will do things such as buy bonds, lower rates to increase reserves. Federal funds rate falls, money supply rises, interest rates fall, investment goes up, demand goes up, and we should get a rise in GDP. That's what the Fed does in times of recession. What is the Fed currently doing right now in times of inflation? And your problem's inflation. The Fed's going to curtail the money supply. They're going to sell bonds, increase the reserve ratio, raise rates, anything like that. The goal being decrease excess reserves, cause interest rates to go up, money supply to fall, spending to decrease in investment, demand to decrease, and eventually break the inflation. Less demand, you're going to get lower prices. So what are the advantages of monetary policy? And we touched upon this quite a bit already, and also when we covered fiscal policy. Number one, it's much faster and more flexible. Fiscal policy, remember, has all of the limitations of the fact that politicians have to find a problem, then agree on a way to fix it. And as you've seen with our politicians, that can be incredibly slow. And then all of the time it takes for it to kick in. Monetary policy is much more quick and flexible. It's isolated from political pressure because, remember, the Fed, they serve long terms and they are not elected officials, they're appointed. So as a consequence, they can do things that may not be immediately popular. And it's also generally more subtle than fiscal policy. It's quickly adaptable, customizable. You're not passing laws. It's not as rigid. So as a consequence, these are some of the advantages of monetary policy. But there are problems, and we'll touch on them in a few slides. Recent U.S. monetary policy, remember, has been highly active. The government is engaged much more so in monetary policy than fiscal policy these days. We've pretty much just been using expansionary fiscal policy without end in the last quarter of a century, and we've used monetary policy instead in times of recessions. So we've been highly active with it. The government's responded with quick and innovative actions during the recent financial crisis and recession. We saw similar things like that during COVID. And critics contend the Fed contributed to the crisis by keeping the rate too low for too long. And you can argue the Fed did this again during COVID, where they kept rates very low for a long period of time. And as a consequence, wound up causing all of the inflation we are now dealing with. After the large recession, we saw a pretty slow recovery. The Fed kept rates very, very low, near zero for a while. But there's a problem there. If you lower rates near zero, you get what's called the zero lower bound problem. You can't lower them anymore. Once they hit zero, that's as low as you can go. So their next response was what was called quantitative easing, which is similar to open market operations, but not designed to lower rates, but just simply increase lending. So the Fed just kept increasing the money supply to increase lending. The problem with quantitative easing is it can cause inflation. And in summer of 2017, they began selling all of these bonds they had bought to tighten the money supply back up. But then COVID happened, and they did it again. And the money supply got so expanded that then you started seeing very large amounts of inflation. So that's what the Fed is currently contending with now. What are some of the problems and complications of monetary policy? Well, just like fiscal policy, there's still recognition and operational lag. It's generally less so, but you still need to realize there's a problem. And even monetary policy still has operational lag. You can't just snap your fingers. The Fed has to craft those policies and put them into effect. So even with monetary policy, it's faster than fiscal, but you would still think there's about a 3 to 6 month delay, and it can cause the Fed to overshoot their targets. Economists also maintain that monetary policy is more effective in dealing with slowing expansions and controlling inflation than it is helping the economy recover from a severe recession. Even though the Fed may create excess reserves during periods of recession, doesn't necessarily mean the banks are going to use the money to loan them out and increase the money supply. So in recent recessionary periods, the U.S. focused more on fiscal policy to spend out of the recession, but we may never know what actually succeeded or what one was more powerful. So you would argue that monetary policy is better for cooling off inflation than it is for helping during a recession, and that is something to consider. And that's going to bring us to our last slide here. And this is the very last slide of the course. The relationship between aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So this illustrates the many concepts and principles we discussed in the preceding chapters and how they relate to each other. Study it and you'll see that the price level, output, employment, and income all result from the interaction of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And there is a more extended version of this graph in your textbook, figure 36.4, that provides more details than is possible to illustrate here. So this is just a good chart that covers a lot of which we've covered in the course of the class. So with this chart, that is going to bring us to the very end of our course, the very end of our last chapter. It's been a pleasure having you for this class, and this is going to take us to the end of chapter 16.